So first, I want to go ahead and introduce our first speaker tonight, who is Dr. Charles P. Morgan. Dr. Morgan is the CEO of the Union Gospel Mission, a Christian ministry that is dedicated to serving people who are struggling with homelessness, poverty, and addiction here in the Twin Cities. Prior to this, Dr. Morgan served as founder and senior pastor of Resurrection Life Fellowship, and that's a non-denominational church located in Westchester, California. And for 33 years, he was pastor there, as well as the vice president of programs at the Los Angeles Mission. Dr. Morgan hails from Thibodaux, Louisiana. He has a doctorate degree in theology, and he is a licensed marriage and family therapist. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Morgan to the Transform Ideas stage. Great. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Thought I'd relax you a little bit. Serious topic, right? But I believe you're here because we sincerely believe that we're called to make a difference in the world. And slavery is a uniquely galvanizing kind of propellant that leads to multi-generational transmission processes, negative affect and trauma in the African American community even until today. I grew up in the Deep South, as Carl said, in Thibodaux, Louisiana, and I went to a predominantly white private school in the 60s during the heyday of the civil rights movement, riots and all that kind of stuff. But for me, it was a pretty good experience at that school. But one day, one of my friends said to me, and he was a friend, he looked at me with this look of caring and he said, "Charlie, you're not black, you're one of us." And so that made me realize that there is a cognitive dissonance in us in America, that we have to redefine people that we previously thought of in our own minds as of a particular degree of value, so that I would be accepted within that community. It presented some problems, but it was a good experience. Even when we look at the Statue of Liberty today, it says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning for freedom." But what people don't know is that Eduardo Laboulaye in 1865 thought of the idea of the Statue of Liberty to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation of slaves. That was kept secret for 125 years in the United States. Again, cognitive dissonance. So if you have a statue in the harbor talking about liberty and freedom, and yet you have people that you're oppressing, there is something disconcerting and incongruent about that. The statue, as it was originally conceived, had changed what the tablet is today. But those that were raising money for it, and probably those that had gained wealth through slavery, said, "Look, bro, you got to get rid of the chains. We can't have that." And so they had a big argument about that, and so they got rid of the chains, and now, of course, we have the tablet. But if you look closely, the chains are at the feet of the lady on the statue, but you can't see them because the platform is so big. But it was celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. I have the responsibility to give you a short history of slavery in a short amount of time. How many know that's a challenging endeavor? But I'm going to strive to do that anyway. When we look at things like racial equity, I have a word I call repairment, because I think racial reconciliation in many arenas has literally lost its meaning, and I think it's a nebulous word that people really don't know what it means. I want to speak to you this evening from an emic perspective rather than an etic perspective. An etic perspective is that of the observer. An emic perspective is that of a participant in the culture that I'm talking about this evening. And so I've experienced personally some of the things that I'm talking with you about tonight. And so when we say reconciliation, if it means the restoration of friendly relations, I think I can say safely that most African Americans are not interested. But if we say the act of making one view compatible with another, and that view is total equality, I think there's an interest in that. Not racial equality, but human equality, because racial equality is an invention of the oppressor. Because we as African Americans have always felt that we're equal, and I will use African American, Negro, and Black, depending on where my head is in the process, so don't get confused. I'm talking about the same people. So how do we define equal justice against the backdrop of 350 years of injustice and cruelty? Racial equity against a scheme of intentional marginalization, diversity against limited opportunity for African Americans for equal employment, when 55% of African Americans, according to a recent report in Minneapolis, we have a situation that is dire. 55% African Americans unemployed males. And so when we look at these kinds of situations, I'm really an individual that really care about immigrants, care about people coming into our country, but I think there's cognitive dissonance within us when we think of some of the things that are going on in our country. We have 2.3 million people in prison. 90% of them got there without a trial. Weren't we marching on that? We have 280,000 on parole, and we have a whopping 3.4 million on probation. And so we have these individuals who won't be able to vote, won't be able to get food stamps, probably won't be able to find a job, but yet we tell them to be contributing members of society when they can't even do jury duty. Cognitive dissonance. We have a problem in America that we really need to understand, and we really need to come to a place of action. That's why I love the word repairment. It's making things right. When I say something needs repair, you can say to me whether or not we can identify what that is, and if we do, then you can choose whether or not you're going to be actively involved in the repair. We can talk about racial reconciliation, we can talk about racial equity, we can talk about disparity all day long and not do a thing about it, but feel good about it because we talk about it. And I said, we talk so much about stuff, we think we're doing it. And so we need to get a place of doing. We're to be what? Doers of the word, not hearers of the word only. 1619, the first slaves arrive in America. 1640, John Punch, enslaved African American, runs away in the Virginia colony. He's caught, comes back, he runs away with 2 other whites. He is given a life sentence of slavery, where the other 2 whites are given a long indentured servanthood. And so right there we begin to see that he is the first case, or recognized as the first case, of legally sanctioning lifelong slavery in America. Historians also consider this to be one of the first legal distinctions between Europeans and Africans made in the colony, and the key milestone in the development of institutional slavery in America. 1662, hereditary slavery. If you're born to a slave mother, you're automatically a slave. 1691, anti-miscegenation laws. You might have seen the recent movie on the Lovings in Virginia. Very good movie, go and see it. In other words, a difference is being made that African Americans, Negroes, are not good enough to marry white people. That is the message that is being given. In 1857, there's the Dred Scott decision, the nadir of Supreme Court decisions, because it's the worst decision ever made by the Supreme Court. Dred Scott sued to be free. He was taken by a slave master to a free state. He wasn't allowed to be free, so the thing went to the Supreme Court. The opinion of the Supreme Court, written by Roger Taney, he wrote the opinion that he was a resolved foe of racial equity, the Republican Party and the anti-slavery movement. So here you have a Supreme Court justice that's already have an opinion about the value of African Americans or Negroes. And so what he writes is, Negroes have no rights in which white people need to respect. This is Supreme Court justice. 7 out of 9 justices agreed with him. Technically, he should have stopped there, because if Negroes had no place in court, he should have dismissed the case. But he didn't stop there. He went on to address the Missouri Compromise, which forbids slavery in the western states. But he uses the Fifth Amendment to argue that a person cannot be robbed of their property without due process of law. So then slavery then is fundamentally a protected property within the United States Constitution. And so my thesis is that slavery and the devaluing of Negroes began at the highest rungs of government in our country, and it was purposeful. It was a purposeful, intentional act. Slavery then is fundamentally protected, and it's the only time, the second time in the history of the Supreme Court, that Congress was said to have passed something that is unconstitutional. 1865, 1868, and 1870 is what we call the anti-slavery amendments, right? 13th Amendment, barring slavery in all of America, all of the states, because the Emancipation Proclamation freed 4 million slaves in the South, but it didn't free all slaves. And so the 14th Amendment, the right to citizenship or naturalization, and the 15th Amendment, the right of Negro males to vote. Now, in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, there was a presidential election. Rutherford B. Hayes had 185 electoral votes, Tilden 184. So they made a decision that if Hayes gets the presidency, he would have to make a deal with the Southern Democrats. That deal was to pull federal troops out of the South. So they made the deal. Guess what happened? The Emancipation Proclamation, all these amendments amounted to nothing, a hill of beans. Why? Because when they pulled the troops out of the South, that led to the Knights of the White Community, the Ku Klux Klan, and the White Citizens Council, and terrorist groups that terrorized Negroes till they were so afraid to vote that is why you had difficulty with Negroes voting, because they were killed, they were lynched. And down in the Equal Justice Initiative, down in Montgomery, there's a whole wall full of jars where they're looking to get soil from over 4,000 documented places where people were lynched. And so when you realize for the African American, for the Negro in America, you cannot divorce the history from where we are as a people today. We are traumatized as a people. We look at, in therapy, women who have been victims of domestic violence and so on and so forth. We go through all kinds of means to make sure they're safe, that they get counseling and so on. I got to tell you, the Negro has never had counseling for slavery. And he's still traumatized. 1896, Plessis versus Ferguson. Wow, the ruling of the Supreme Court was separate but equal. Separate but equal. We got the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, so we can't have slavery, so we'll have separate but equal. Undergirding the idea that the Negro is still not equal. And following the Plessy decision, restrictive legislation based on race continually expanded, and its reason was not overturned to Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. In 1955, that's when Emmett Till, a young black boy, 14 years old, was murdered, killed, eyes gouged out, made to carry a fan to the Tallahatchie River, shot him in the head and threw him in the river. His mother's, after they found his body, was all distorted, bloated, and she brought it to Chicago. She said, I want people to see what they're doing to Negroes in America. That was August 1955. December 1955, Rosa Parks sat on the bus and refused to give her seat to a white man. That started what we know today as the Civil Rights Movement. And so as we look at these developing kinds of things that come about, we look at the sociological and the psychological impact upon African Americans. Because of this long history of oppression and the disenfranchisement of the Negro, we have to find our worth in our own community. But how do we find our worth in our own community when we're stepping over condoms and drug vials? How do we find it when our schools, we pass through metal detectors? How do we find it when our pools are not maintained and there's rats in the building? And so we have these issues that we need to deal with as a country. To the outward world, the Negro has been essentially invisible without a designated place of importance in the dominant culture. Growing up in the Deep South, being invisible is one of the greatest harms you can inflict on a human soul, because it tells you you're not valuable. It tells you you don't belong. It tells you that you're nobodiness, and Dr. King called this the nagging sense of nobodiness. Jesse Owens, who was a gold medal Olympian, came back to the United States. They gave him a party to recognize him in New York. He had to go through the back door of the hotel to go to his own party that was honoring him as an Olympian. Black servicemen turning from World War I, World War II, coming back in uniforms, being murdered by whites in the South. Cognitive dissonance, couldn't stand to see a Negro in a uniform that was equal to his or her own, and so they murdered him out in the street. The slave master inculcated the slave with certain beliefs that is a residue to this very day in terms of black identity. We have internalized inferiority as a people, and we have to come to grips with some things ourselves, even in counseling and therapy. Every African-American male I've worked with in therapy has this voice in the back of their mind, even when things that are going well. Something is going to happen and it's all going to be taken away from me. So we as African-Americans must engage face to face with ourselves and resolve our own pain and our own internalized inferiority as a race. And whites must confront your sense of guilt when we talk about these things. Because you say, oh, I wasn't there, but the reality is you benefited. You benefited from being in a posture where you're given an identity, where you're given avenues to be able to make it in life. For instance, in the New Deal, the Fair Deal of Roosevelt, we had the GI Bill, and out of 160,000 loans given, less than 100 was given to people of color. Down in Alabama and Mississippi, the same GI Bill, out of some 3,229, one was given to an African American or a Negro. And so it created economic disparity that continues to contribute to the African American community even into this day. So is there work to be done? Oh yeah, there's work to be done. Yeah, is there laws to be passed? Maybe so. But throughout our history, laws affirming Negro rights have consistently been circumvented by ingenious evasions which render them void in practice. Laws passed for Negroes' benefits are so widely unenforced that it is a mockery to call them laws. And so even in the South, as we go back, we were in Alabama recently, lawyers were telling us Alabama still has a racist constitution, but they fly under the radar. It is still an issue, it's still a problem. One of the ladies working in the museum said she moved into a white neighborhood and they came to her house asking, do you belong in this house? I'm talking about 2017. So what is the church's responsibility in all of this? Acts says from one man, he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. So there's only one race, the human race. Race, as we think about it today, is a figment of men's imaginations. I don't want to be racially equal. I want to be equal. I want my people to be equal. Luke says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he had anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. Amos said, but let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Victor Hugo a century ago wrote, if the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. But the guilty one is not the one who commits the sin, but the one who causes the darkness. And that's what we must realize. We cannot be passively associated with what's going on in our country today. For he that passively agrees with evil becomes an active participant of it. And the church is guilty. And the judgment of God is upon the church today. And we see it in that people don't know their Bibles. We see it in that people don't know the God of the Bible as he's revealed himself in his own word. We see people who don't have the power to walk in holiness and magnify the Lord and have a zeal to witness and to minister to the unsaved. Yea, the judgment of God is upon the church because of our sin and our disobedience and because we passively stood by and allowed these things to occur in our midst. There's an excuse for the world. They're blind, they're ignorant, they owe nothing to righteousness. But we are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. And this is our responsibility to make known the will of God in the earth. And when I think of who we are, when I think of Dr. King, when I took my family on a plantation tour, I grew up in the South playing on plantations, but I decided to take my family on a plantation tour. And what did I do that for? I heard the voices of slaves crying from the ground to me saying, do not let people forget what we went through. And so I vowed that I'm not going to let people forget. I'm not an angry black man. I'm not bitter. I'm a lover of Jesus. I'm a Christ follower. I'm already forgiven. Hallelujah. I don't need to be reconciled because that's already a part of who I am. But what I do want to do is make people aware that repentance is necessary for us to be able to do the things that God has commanded us to do. And I stand ready to be a vessel meet for the Master's use. God bless you this evening.